They said Silver Creek was a town that kept its own council. Pines stood like jurors along the road in and never bothered to look at the cars passing under them. The river braided itself around basalt like a patient argument. The mine entrances that still pockmarked the hillsides had been boarded decades ago, and the boards had turned the color of old tea. People kept their heads down. People remembered more than they admitted. Detective Mark Ellison arrived the way he arrived at most things. Quietly, a notebook tucked into the inner pocket of a jacket that fit better in fall than midsummer. He was 46, the kind of man who wrote complete sentences in his field notes, because once, early in his career, a judge had scolded him for bullet points that made facts sound optional. He parked below the trailhead as thunder pressed its thumb against the ridge and listened to the trees say as little as they could. The call had come that morning. A civil engineer named Alan Morris, mid-40s, careful with his gear, contracted to the state to map fault lines for a new highway. Spur was overdue. He'd camped 3 nights near Caldwell Ridge, texted his wife from a high spot on Monday evening, told a coworker he'd check a noise near an old ranger station that wasn't on any modern map, and then vanished into the gap between 2 sentences. His truck sat where he'd left it, door locked, maps spread on the seat like a small paper continent. The last entry in his field notebook, penciled in a hand that was harder than it meant to be, read, "Heard it again. Low hum from below near Station 12. Not wind." Station 12 did not exist, according to the Forestry Service. The clerk on the phone had sounded apologetic and bored at the same time. "We had a Station 10 up here once. 12s are for other districts." Ellison had thanked her and said nothing about the yellowed wall map in the sheriff's hallway that showed a faint square, once labeled, now rubbed almost clean, under the words, "Ranger Stations. Historic." He had spent long enough in counties like this to know that "doesn't exist" and "isn't in the database" are not synonyms. The first day on the ridge learned him nothing he wanted and everything he disliked. The slope took sound and handed back echo. Radios buzzed in a tight radius where the ground curved, and the air, though warm against his sleeves, held a metallic chill when he stepped into the shadow of the big cedar above the old foundation. The foundation itself was a concrete rectangle sprigged with rusted anchor bolts. Somebody had once meant to hold something down very firmly here. Now Moss did the holding. Ellison crouched and slid a gloved finger under the edge of a thin plate, glinting among the needles. He rubbed away mud. Stenciled letters answered the light as if waking. RS-12, property of U.S. Interior. He had a ranger with him that afternoon, a narrow man named Baird, who had a good face for bad news. "Never seen that," Baird said, which might have meant he truly hadn't, or might have meant he knew when to keep a thing unsaid. Lightning sketched itself once against the far ridge, and the storm pushed them off the hill. In the motel that night, Ellison played back the pocket recorder he'd left running while the wind tried to rearrange the trees. The hum was on the tape low, almost under hearing, 27 cycles per second, if the lab later could be trusted, the sort of sound that begins in your bones, and only later asks your ears to participate. Under it, his own breath hissed, and over that, a smear of static that flirted with a syllable you could pretend said, "down." He marked the time code, sent the file to a state tech with a note that said, "Geologic?" and wrote the word "subsonic" on the top of a page, as if naming a thing might keep it from moving. He started small, because small things were the only honest ones. Breakfast at Warren's Diner, the coffee as black as a reprimand, the counter sticky with long stories. He showed a photo of Morris around and accepted the shrug as the town's first answer. The old man in the corner, who wore a hat like a contract, cleared his throat and said, "That's the vent man," as if it were a species. He asked me where the ground sinks. I told him you don't want to stand on a choir. Ellison smiled and waited the way you wait for a drunk to decide he's confessional. My father worked the Hyadettes, the waitress added, sliding a plate that didn't quite stop. Back in '79, they shut a patch down above Caldwell. Said the rock went wrong. Said the sound wouldn't stop. A crew didn't come out. Folks started calling it the quiet place because nobody would talk about it. Ellison wrote, 79 crew? Quiet place, sound, and underlined the year. The wife, Laura, didn't cry when he knocked. She held herself like a person accustomed to finishing other people's sentences, and now out of practice. Alan wasn't a romantic, she said, putting a small flash drive into his palm, as if it might choose a side. He did math. He argued with instruments when they betrayed him. He texted me from the past Sunday, said he heard a machine buried below the ridge. I told him machines don't live in dirt. She looked at Ellison, as if to ask whether this had been unkind or only naive. He laughed, she said. He always laughed when I made the wrong objection. Back at his desk, Ellison opened the drive. Morris had been the sort of man who dated folders. The newest held photo logs, GPS tracks that stuttered where coverage died, and a single audio file labeled Arnabuantuan 1907 Wave. The hum was there again, louder. And then, close to the microphone, metal answered itself 3 times. Not clangs. The sound was too tired, too deliberate. Knock, knock, knock. He watched the spectrogram as the knocks rose and faded. The bands, blurred by distance, arranged themselves into letters without quite daring to. R, S, 1, 2. It was the kind of thing a man sees after staring too long, and he knew it, but he also knew how often the human eye tells the truth by accident. He drove down to Denver on a day that smelled like rain and bureaucracy, and got a day pass to the state archives. It took 3 clerks and 1 librarian, who had decided that curiosity was a form of civic virtue, to find a box that should have been in another building. The sticker on the lid said, Interior Depth. Subsurface Acoustic Testing, Caldwell Ridge, CO, 1969-70, in the handwriting of someone who had never thought his labels would matter to strangers. Redactions shouldered most of the pages like bouncers. A memo that survived long enough to be read said, Facility RS-12 established for long-term resonance experiments under Project Quiet Earth. Operations ceased after anomaly during Cycle 14. Recommend burial. Do not re-enter. In pencil, a marginal note, below 30 hertz, resonance in metal and men? The question mark looked embarrassed. When he got back to Silver Creek, the air felt as if it had been combed. The search officially wound down on a Thursday afternoon. The sheriff stood under a pop-up tent and said the words people say when outlasting a good thing is the only way to stop losing. Ellison went home to a small kitchen that had forgotten how to feed too. He cleaned his pocket recorder with a cotton swab, like that might erase something he didn't quite believe in. Then he set the alarm for 4 a.m. and put his boots near the door. He had no permission to go back up without a partner. He had something older than permission. The ridge welcomed him with fog that decided, generously, not to be thick until he had reached the foundation. The big cedar held its breath. He took a knee and let his eyes adjust. The moss looked wrong where it met the concrete. Not disturbed recently, not trampled, but combed by weather in a pattern that suggested a curve under soil where no curve belonged. He used a folding trowel the way you use a word you promised not to and cleared 6 inches. His knuckles brushed metal. He scraped more, slower. The line of a hinge declared itself along one edge like a scar. He wanted to stop. He wanted to leave. He wanted, at last, to know. He slid his fingers under a lip that wasn't a lip a moment ago and lifted. Cold air rose. Not cave. Cave air smells like water's patience, but something that had collected itself until it learned not to move. He set the plate back against the dirt, to keep it from advertising him, and shone a light. A short ladder descended into a throat of corrugated steel, the ribs shining where boot soles had not polished them for decades. He did not go down. He did what training makes even the impatient do. He listened. At first he heard his own pulse because it had decided to arrive early. Then he heard nothing at all. Then, without hurry, like a courtesy extended to a stranger, 3 knocks came up through the metal. He closed the hatch because you close the thing you don't yet understand. He took photographs with a hand that had found its tremor and made it behave. He marked the coordinates and sent a message he didn't intend to be a request to the sheriff. I may have located a sealed subsurface access at the Morris scene. Need Ranger support and USFS liaison. Safety concern. Stability. He did not mention the sound. He walked down the hill slower than fear would have liked, and the fog did not follow him because it was busy where it was. The liaison call came with the tone of men who mistake silence for cooperation. Any excavation must be authorized, the woman on the line said, and her voice was all velvet over wire. Historic installations pose hazards the public cannot evaluate. Ellison said yes the way you say yes when you intend it to stand in for other words. He checked the weather, checked the calendar, and then checked the habits of men who prefer not to be seen doing their work in daylight. He still had a state lab response to read. The audio tech had sent an email with a longer note than techs allow themselves when they're excited. Your hum sits around 27 hertz, with harmonic bleed at 54 and 81 cleaner than wind, dirtier than a motor. Geological sources can make that, but the even spacing of the knocks sits like machinery. Also, this could be pareidolia, but there's a faint amplitude modulation that repeats every 4.2 seconds too regular for rockfall. If you have more, I want it. Ellison thumbed the screen dark and looked around the office that had learned his shoulders. On the wall, the old map smiled clear in one place. It hadn't yesterday. The squares for stations 8, 9, 10 wore their labels. Station 12's label had been erased long ago, but the paper still remembered the pressure of ink. He went back to the diner because confessions grow there like ivy. The waitress said his name like a diagnosis and poured without asking. 2 seats down, a man with drywall dust in his hair said he'd taken delivery of 4 pallets of bagged lime months back for a forestry project that no one saw again. They paid cash, he said. Paperwork said erosion control. I don't argue with people who carry clipboards and say erosion at me. I carry the bags where they point. In his notebook, Ellison wrote lime cover, and then, smaller, not burial mask. Laura called before dusk, her voice in that register people use when they are practicing not to hope. Did you find him? She asked, and he told the only honest truth available. I found the place he was going. He asked permission to image her husband's laptop. She said yes without asking the usual questions about warrants and property, because she had moved past interested into whatever comes after. The machine coughed up exactly what he feared and needed. A draft email to his co-worker Ryan, unsent, time-stamped near midnight Sunday. If I don't check in by Tuesday, Station 12 under the concrete. Not a culvert. Something with a door. Low hum feels like standing near a transformer. Don't come alone. If locked, get Baird or a badge. Don't tell Ranger Hopkins. He lies. Ellison read it twice. He did not know Hopkins, but he knew men like him. Hopkins, when he met him, was 60 in the way Oak is 60. His vest bore patches that told other men to trust him. You're looking for a contractor with more confidence than sense, Hopkins said, mouth smiling, eyes not. Road crews wander. Ridge weather takes what it wants. I don't know your Station 12. The only station I know up there is a station that stays closed. Ellison asked him to repeat that last sentence, because sometimes A man will show you the part of his truth he dresses in a joke. Closed, Hopkins said again, and his mouth enjoyed the word. The next day brought paperwork that pretended it was permission. Limited non-invasive survey. 1 day. Daylight hours. USFS notified. He took SNR officer Lena Cruz good knees, good temper, and a county geotech, Devin Sato, who liked dirt more than he liked people, and therefore told the truth more often than most. The ground-penetrating radar bounced its beeps along a neat transect and drew ghosts beneath the surface. Under the cedar and to the north, a smooth reflector bloomed at a depth that made no sense for rock a curve, a void beyond it, a clean shadow that machines make when men carve space inside soil. Sato tapped the screen and pointed with the kind of finger that doesn't believe in epiphany. Plate over air, he said. Not natural. Old, but not dead. They documented, took photographs that would later be filed under insufficient, and packed up when the liaison truck appeared at the trailhead, like a sentence written in a font large enough for a child. They smiled. They spoke of slope stability. They suggested erosion repairs. They did not mention doors. Ellison went back alone because men like him always go back alone once. He parked farther down, left the car hidden by what passed here for underbrush, and walked the last half-mile under a sky that had decided to behave. The hatch lifted easier than it should have. Somebody had loosened bolts between yesterday and today, or else bolts had never mattered. He lowered his light. He did not descend. He held the beam steady and let it spend itself along the steel ribs. The ladder shone where hands had never polished it. He met himself at the moment between look and leap and told himself the correct lie. I'm only going to see the first landing. He meant to keep it. He shook the ladder once. It answered with the old voice of metal. Then he put one boot rung-wise down. He did not hear the hum then. He heard only the hiss of his own breath and the small bravery of rubber on old steel. He stepped back immediately because self-respect is a kind of harness. He replaced the plate and dressed the soil over it with a blind man's care until the ground looked like ground had always looked there. When he straightened, the forest returned to itself all at once, like a face that had been listening at a door and decided to look unconcerned. He took 2 steps away, and the sound arrived. 3 slow knocks from below, equal in their patience, the kind of sound a man makes when he hopes not to frighten a house. He filed the day's work into sentences that would not embarrass him later. He did not write the word haunted because he did not believe in it. He wrote pattern and recurrence and contact and let the nouns do the labor. He slept badly, woke to the lab's second email. 207 Hertz confirmed. Knox intervals are 2.0s. Harmonics suggest enclosed volume, and to a voicemail from a number that identified itself as Federal Land Safety Division. The message said nothing useful. We have your coordinates. Do not proceed without appropriate agency presence. Subgrade infrastructure may be unstable. Thank you for your cooperation. He called the number back and found it gone. By the end of that week, he had enough for a press release that told the town we had not found him and told the town nothing else. He drove past the diner and did not go in because people ask the wrong small questions when what you owe them is a large answer you cannot give. He stopped by Laura's with a paper bag of groceries meant to look like an errand and said he would not stop. She nodded like a person who has learned what decisions weigh. He returned, one more evening, to the cedar and the concrete. He tapped the hatch with the handle of his trowel, not hard, just enough to see whether steel still remembered how to sound like itself. From below, after a pause a little longer than manners require, 3 knocks rose to meet him. Not louder, not nearer, only certain. He did not reply. He put his ear to the metal instead. It felt like leaning against a door in a hallway where you are not a guest. Something on the other side settled, A soft shift, like a chair moved a fraction by someone who had been waiting too long. He stood, brushed dirt from his hands onto a rag he had brought because he knew he would be ashamed of putting it on his trousers, and covered the hole again. He walked back to his car without looking behind him, because looking would have begged the wrong favor from the wrong thing. In his notebook that night, he wrote, without decoration, Morris likely found RS-12 access. Hum present. Knox present. Station label confirmed. Plate. Audio evidence support subgrade chamber. Next, obtain records. Quiet Earth. Interview retired engineer. 6970 program. Request USFS archive of decommission procedures. Consider camera drop, tether, before entry. Then, lower, in a hand that belonged to the part of him that had not tired yet, he wrote, If something happens, I was here at 1922. I heard 3 knocks. The ground answered. I left it closed. Part 1 ends where his discipline makes it end. Not with dissent, not with triumph, but with a door located and a line drawn. The ridge held its breath. The town went on, pretending not to care. Somewhere below the cedar, air coiled on itself as if waiting for a better sentence than any of the ones he had made. And Ellison, who had been a policeman long enough to know that patience is an instrument like any other, set his alarm for a time that did not exist yet, and wrote a name in the margin he did not intend anyone else to read. RS-12. The paper took the ink and kept its mouth shut. The metal below did the same. For the moment. Понял. Делаю вторую часть заново, сплошным текстом, без заголовков и нумерации, с наращенным объемом. For 3 nights in a row, the mountain visited him without moving, as if the ridge had learned the route to his house and preferred to arrive as a vibration instead of a road. It came through the floorboards and the cabinet glass, a patient pressure at the edge of hearing that made cups sing if he set them too near one another. Ellison tried the old tricks, unplug the refrigerator, kill the breaker to the back room, sit in the dark, and count his own pulse. Each time the hum remained. When he leaned his palm to the hardwood, he could feel it, as if someone had rested a plate against the joists and began to speak in a voice that had forgotten language, but not cadence. On the 4th night, he placed his smallest field recorder directly on the floor and let it run until the battery gave up. The morning waveform looked like a mountain range done in pencil. Long valleys at 27 hertz, occasional narrow peaks rising in a triplet, 3 teeth that repeated like a superstition. He deleted the file, then immediately regretted it, and restored it from the trash, angry at himself for believing that computers have a concept of garbage and grace. At the station, he began to hide his work like a teenager, saving documents with innocuous names, scribbling on legal pads, and then tucking the pages beneath procedural manuals nobody touched. The sheriff's memo about federal containment of the ridge made the rounds and returned with initials added in the edges. Approved, noted, yes, yes. He did not sign it. When colleagues asked, he said desk duty suited him and that the case had moved beyond him, and in a way both were true. The part of the case that involved permits and fences and government seals had indeed moved beyond him. The part beneath it, the human part, the part that asked where a middle-aged man named Alan Morris had put his last breath, had not gone anywhere at all. He visited Laura once a week, and never empty-handed. He brought groceries the first 2 times and lumbered the 3rd, because her fence was missing a board, and he understood how grief drafts us into maintaining small things. She poured coffee that always tasted like she'd counted the scoops wrong on purpose. On his 4th visit, she produced a cardboard box from the back closet and slid it across the table. The rest of his field backups, she said. He'd bring home the week on Fridays. I didn't want to open it without you. Inside were map pocket prints, a spool of fluorescent flagging tape, one rental receipt from a hardware store near the pass for a concrete drill he had never returned, and 2 labeled flash drives. He moved like a careful thief while he handled them, partly because he wanted to do no harm, partly because the box felt like the last room in a house where all the other doors had been removed. The first flash drive held photos he had already seen in lower resolution, now sharper. Composite panoramas of Caldwell Ridge stitched together from a careful tripod. 2 images of the old foundation taken at sunset, when the concrete seemed to hold light inside itself like a secret, and a dozen close-ups of soil and moss and root, each labeled with coordinates, and the note, vibration sustained. The second drive held audio, a folder of files named by date and hour. He plugged in his headphones, flattened his breath, and listened to late June nights and early July afternoons. For long stretches there was only wind and a man muttering to himself while he worked. But at 1:13 on a Monday, a tone swelled out of the dark and settled into steadiness. And then 3 metal knocks, equally spaced, and Morris's own voice breaking into a laugh that wasn't humor. "It's not wind," the voice said, very quietly, a confession issued to no one. The drill receipt bothered him more than it should have. He drove to the rental counter, showed the slip, smiled the way polite policemen have learned to smile when they want more cooperation than rules demand. The manager checked her terminal and frowned. "He never returned it," she said, confirming what the paper had already admitted. "We charged his card the full replacement cost, and then somebody from a federal office called and told us to send them the tool if it showed up. It never did." Ellison asked if the agent had left a name. "Just a callback number." She slid a sticky note across the counter. It held 10 digits and the scent of old glue. The number went nowhere when he tried it, ringing twice, and then falling into a recording that announced a full mailbox in a voice that belonged to no person. He pocketed the note anyway, because objects accrue meaning when refused. He drove out to the pass because motion has always been the antidote humans apply to their own thinking. The Forest Service had widened the pullout and posted a laminated notice about slope stability, trail closures, and fines for trespassing that grew more stern as the bullet points descended. The foundation at the clearing bore a shallow scar of new fill. The air smelled of steel and mud in the way work sites smell when the workers are elsewhere. The hatch was invisible, buried beneath 2 feet of compacted dirt. Ellison crouched and pressed his palm to the ground like a man at a grave. If the hum came now, it hid behind wind. He walked the perimeter with his hands in his pockets, and the sense that being observed is not incompatible with being alone. He drove to Salida again to see Lemaine, because the old man had the shape of the answers, even when the answers refused to stand. The cabin's porch light was on, though the sun still had an edge. Lemaine looked thinner, the circles beneath his eyes deeper, as if the hum had found him too, farther south but still within reach. "We gave the mountain a violin," he said without greeting, "and then we tuned it to a pitch it never meant to know." Ellison sat opposite him at the small table and let the comparison hold. What was Cycle 15 supposed to do? The old man's mouth twitched. "We never ran it. The schedule survived our courage. Cycle 15 was a sustained run, near the resonance we measured in the collapse zone. The Bureau wanted to see if the fatigue we saw in steel would extend to rock. We argued that fatigue is a word for bodies, not for mountains." He reached behind him and pulled a file that had done time in different drawers. "We had a diagram of the lower vaults, the tunnels you can't reach without cutting through. There's a chamber we called the throat. If you ever hear the knocks near that, don't answer." Ellison swallowed a joke that would have tried to save them with levity. "Do you think the knocks are human?" The hearing aids whined and settled. "I think resonance is a tyrant," Lemaine said. "Give it a shape, and it wants to repeat. We built a shape down there. We taught the mountain how to count to 3. On the way home, he stopped in Buena Vista for gas and a burger that bled onto its paper in a way he found reassuring. The waitress asked if he wanted more napkins, and he said yes to be polite, and then used all of them because politeness had become necessary. On the radio, a preacher's voice argued with itself between AM static until he turned the dial and caught a faint whistle at a pitch he had learned to recognize now without admitting it. He parked in his driveway and sat in the cooling car, listening to the engine tick and the night shape itself around the house. Inside, he wrote a letter in longhand, with the understanding that letters pointed themselves in two directions at once. He told himself it was for Laura, then folded it into an unaddressed envelope and wrote instead in the corner, "Open if I do not return from Caldwell." He placed it in the kitchen drawer where he kept tape, twine, and other items that exist to tie disparate things together. Days slid past with the tautness of string. The federal trucks came and went, leaving fresh paint on tree trunks and pallet marks in the dirt. A portable generator chattered one afternoon. Then a silence so complete it seemed measured settled over the ridge, as if a lid had been fitted to sky. The sheriff told him, "It's handled," in the tone people use when they want to trade one man's curiosity for a department's peace. Ellison nodded, filed 2 backlogged reports with furious neatness, and left early without clocking out. He drove to the north side of the valley, where a service road old enough to believe in itself wandered up toward a survey marker he had never had cause to visit. The road turned to 2 ruts, and then to an idea. Pines crowded the hood. He walked the last half-mile with a coil of paracord over his shoulder and a camera clipped to his chest. He found the second access by accident, after deciding he had not come for it. A sinkhole the size of a truck tire had opened in moss and loose soil, and in its center, the edge of a circle showed metal, not rock, under a fingernail layer of dirt. He cleared with his hands and found a smaller hatch than the one at the foundation, one that looked like a service port for a service port. The bolts were new. He touched them and smelled oil. Somebody had come up this way recently with tools, and the confidence tools give. There was no hum here, or rather, there was no hum he could hear, which he knew by now did not always mean silence. He photographed the plate and the surrounding trees. Then the boot prints he almost stepped in, a tread pattern that matched the federal boots at the other site. He set the camera to video and placed it on a stone. Into the lens, he said, "Second access located north quadrant, likely auxiliary tie-in. Bolts new. No obvious vibration. If you are watching this and I'm not here to narrate, please assume I had sense enough not to open it." He turned off the camera and sat on the root of a spruce, because fear takes energy, and he had finally allowed himself to spend some. In town that evening, every conversation sounded like a cover story. The hardware store clerk talked too quickly about tarps. The diner's grill hissed with water when it should have hissed with fat. When he asked after Ranger Hopkins, he learned the man had taken vacation, which is a word that in small towns means either fishing or trouble. Ellison drove to Hopkins's small house and knocked until a neighbor in paint-splattered jeans told him Hopkins had left yesterday before dawn with a duffel and his old radio. Said he was going to check old lines, the neighbor said, as if that meant anything still. Ellison left a card tucked under the door, because detective work is sometimes only an insistence on continuing to exist in other people's kitchens. The lab called to say that the last week's recordings he had mailed over showed a drift of fractional change in the carrier frequency he had come to think of as fixed. "It's sliding," the tech said, and he could hear a kind of thrill under her caution, the way climbers talk about a cornice. 27 hertz plus a whisper. That's not geological. Or if it is, it's geology with a hand on the dial. He asked what that meant in terms that would help him not sleep more efficiently. It means someone's adding energy to the system, or the system to itself. Either way, it won't stay politely out of our way. He asked if they could triangulate. Not with 2 ears and 1 county, she said. If you had 3 stations recording simultaneously, maybe. But you don't. He called Mark Ellison. Not a relative, a journalist he had met on a case 2 years ago who retained her own last name like a promise. She worked state desks and loved archives the way some people love dogs. If a document existed in a basement, she could coax it up the stairs. He asked her to look for procurement under shell companies naming Resonance or Acoustic Monitoring and Zone B near Silver Creek. "You're not going to tell me what this is?" she asked. "Not yet." "Then I'm not going to tell you whether I find something." He smiled because she was right. 2 hours later, she texted a single page. A purchase order for seismic dampers, low-frequency isolators, shipping to a warehouse 3 counties east for transfer to a forestry yard near the pass. Delivery scheduled in 9 days. There was a line item for lime. There is always a line item for lime when men intend to forget. Sleep came shallow and stayed shallow, but dreams went deep. In one, he stood at the base of a metal stair that turned on itself like a coiled spring, and above him, a light pulsed 3 times and paused. 3 and pause, like a heartbeat written by a meticulous god. In another, he held the GPS he had found and watched the coordinates march, not across the map, but under it, as if the machine had learned about direction in a new axis. He woke with the bitter humor of a man who recognizes that his mind has become complicit. He showered in water that tasted faintly of coins, dressed, and wrote 3 plans that pretended to be 1. The official plan said he would revisit the ridge's eastern flank to confirm abandonments cited in the federal memo. The private plan said he would drop a camera a second time into the first shaft, now welded, but perhaps imperfectly. The plan between plans said he would go to Laura's and tell her that none of this meant anything he could guarantee. He chose the camera first. At the foundation clearing in mid-afternoon, the light made a shine on the new plate that turned it into a mirror. He set the camera at the edge and let a weight carry it down a crack between plate and soil that a careful welder would have filled, and a hurried one might not. The camera bumped and scraped, recording blur and black and the steady little green dot of its own insistence. At 8 feet, the line stopped paying out freely. He jiggled it like a fisherman and felt a give. The picture stabilized on gray. Then, unhelpfully, and perfectly, the audio picked up the hum. He hadn't heard it on the surface. The device had heard it below. He held the line and stared at the trembling in his hand that did not belong to him. 3 knocks arrived, soft through metal, the way courtesy arrives from certain homes where people still believe in it. He hauled the camera out, heart doing what hearts do when they understand less than they want and more than is comfortable. Back in his car, he watched the footage 3 times, looking for any motion in the gray, finding only the shift of the world inside the sound. He went to Laura's with hands that wished to empty themselves of the bag they carried. He expected to lie again, gently, with more omission than invention. She met him at the door with a steadiness that made lying impossible. "Don't protect me," she said, as if they had been arguing mid-sentence. "If you found something, even if it's just a sound, tell me. Sound is something." He sat at the table that had learned how to hold bad news and played the recording with the volume low. When the knocks came, she closed her eyes. "He had a way of tapping when he was thinking," she said, once the room remembered how to be a room. At dinner, if he couldn't find words, he'd knock them first. 3. Always. 3. It drove me crazy when I wanted him to say yes or no. "Do you think—" She stopped and let the word hover above the form of the question. "I think the world permits us kindness sometimes," Ellison said. "I don't know in which direction it travels." She did not ask him to leave, and he did not stay. choosing the narrow, safe middle where respect lives. On the 8th day, the warehouse delivery shifted to fulfilled. He watched the status change on a screen Mara had accessed without telling him how, and pretended not to notice that complicity now had a web interface. He called the sheriff and asked for a meeting. "We're past meetings," the sheriff said, but set a time anyway. In the office, he handed over copies of the camera footage, the procurement list, and a letter he had written in that same kitchen drawer script, this one addressed to the department itself. "If I'm not at my desk Monday, assume I've taken personal leave," he said. "Write me up. I'll sign it when I get back." The sheriff studied him with the tired affection of a man who has had to love stubbornness in his children and his staff. "Mark, you don't know that there's a body down there. You don't even know there's a there down there." Ellison nodded. "That's the point of going." The ridge accepted him again that evening, as if the mountain had kept his spot. The generator returned somewhere beyond sight, a far-off chug that pretended to be weather. He cut across the slope to the auxiliary hatch and listened. Below him, the hum warbled. A complex thing. No longer the strict 27 hertz, but a weave. He laid his cheek to the metal and closed his eyes. He thought he could hear water somewhere, tough and old, moving around shapes men had given it. He thought he could hear the smallest mechanical complaint, the kind a bearing makes when it begins to understand its own mortality. He lifted his head and said, "Because saying is sometimes a tool. I don't have a key, but I have time." From the trees behind him, a bird called twice and was silent, as if regretting speech. He did not break the hatch that night. He did not do anything that could be mistaken for a felony by a man inclined to misunderstand. He did what good detectives have always done when their hands are not allowed to move. He watched. He sat in the shadow of a stump until the staff cars returned, lights low, men in vests unloading casings of isolators and standing between the plate and the air as if their bodies could convince the two to remain separate. He watched them feed cables into the ground and check a laptop that glowed with graphs. He watched one of them lift a radio and say, "Stability poor in B, improving in A. Oscillation sliding up. Hold until 90 minutes and then flood." The word flood made exact sense. Lime, foam, grout. The ways we convert place into absence. He did not move, because discovery would transform him into part of the story they would then own. When they left after midnight, he approached the plate and attempted to hear what they had heard. The hum had thinned, like a note sustained too long. He made himself leave. At the car, he found a note under the wiper, folded into a square, small enough that it might have been paper once used to wrap a ring. Inside, a handwriting he did not know. Ranger Station 12, lower access, tonight. Below that, a coordinate in degrees and minutes. He looked at the line twice. The spot sat a mile east, at the edge of a ravine the maps called ordinary. He drove there with his headlights off and his heart hammered to match the knocks he hoped and dreaded. The ravine held nothing but stones and a fallen log, until he stepped behind the log and saw the square of plywood set, flush into dirt. Someone had cut a handle into it and painted the surface the color of shade. He lifted. Cold air rushed up. A steel ladder descended into a slot that felt newer than the others, maybe cut last month by men who did not intend to tell their bosses they had done so. He listened until his ears thought they had become hums themselves. Then he began to climb. The slot turned after 10 feet into a chamber that belonged neither to the old program nor to the mountain. The walls were plywood braced to steel ribs. Cables ran in bundles, labeled with tags printed yesterday. An instrument table held a laptop secured with a chain and a handwritten log. On the floor sat a plastic crate filled with disposable coveralls, masks, and a tub that probably contained a neutralizing agent if one took its label seriously. On the far wall, cut through the temporary paneling, an older door showed, the paint flaking, the stenciled numbers mostly gone. 12. He set his recorder on the table and oriented the beam of his light between bracing and hinge. He pronounced Alan Morris's name aloud as if calling a roll. From inside the old door, separated from him by perhaps 6 inches of steel and 40 years of other men's decisions, 3 knocks answered, not with the crisp metal-on-metal he had heard elsewhere, but with a duller timbre, as if the space beyond had been half-filled with something that turned the air thick. He closed his eyes. He did not knock back, still faithful to the single superstition he had chosen from the many available. Do not teach a rhythm to continue. When he opened them again, a drip formed on the door's edge and fell, black in his beam, smelling of earth and lime. He looked at the log now. Finally, because meaning sometimes hides in handwriting. The last line, written 90 minutes earlier, read, Cycle. 15 containment run, stabilization attempt. Subjective knocks persist. The initials that followed were indecipherable. A line below that in a different hand read, Stop, not stabilizing. It had been crossed out, hard. When he climbed out of the temporary access, the night had moved on without him. Stars did their indifferent work. Somewhere, a coyote announced its jurisdiction. He replaced the plywood and brushed the dirt with his gloves in wide housewife circles until the ground looked like ground again. He took 3 steps away and halted because the air behind him shivered in a way that meant something had changed. He turned and put his ear to the plywood. The hum had shifted up a hair, like a singer getting ready to reach, and under it, he thought he could hear, not knocks, not voice, but a slow, regular scrape, the kind a chair leg makes in a careful room. He did not decide what it meant. He drove home with the windows down because he wanted the outside and the inside to become the same temperature. At his kitchen table, with the letter in the drawer, pressing against the wood from inside as if eager to be substitute breathing, he wrote the night's account with the clarity that comes when adrenaline finally has nowhere else to go. He included coordinates, words men in offices would read, with an expression they practice in mirrors, and times. He wrote, and in the margin, smaller, where he would see it later and pretend someone else had written it. Do not answer. Find another way to say, I hear you. When he slept finally near dawn, the mountain arrived again, not as a hum, but as 3 quiet knocks on the back of his dream. And because he is human, he answered. And because he is also a detective, he woke immediately ashamed. He sat up, swung his feet to the floor, and waited to see whether the house would learn the rhythm. It did not. Outside, morning began pretending to be ordinary, and inside, a man in a small town realized that ordinary is the most elaborate disguise the world ever made. He called Mara at 9 and told her everything he had not told her. She swore in a language he didn't know she knew and said, I'll file records requests for the division that doesn't exist. He laughed once, and it sounded like a door hinge, and then he told her about the knocks, and she stopped joking. I'll set up 3 cheap recorders around town, she said. If the frequency drifts again, we'll at least know whether it's local to you or general. They agreed to meet at the diner because coffee stains on public tables make secrecy look like work. Warren poured until she could not pour any more, and then lingered. And once she walked away, Mara leaned in and said, If something down there is patterned, it's information, not haunting. He appreciated the way her mind wore shoes. By evening, the federal trucks had returned to the ridge, and a crane had joined their party, its arm like a question posed to the dark. Ellison parked where nobody would decide his presence meant anything, and hiked up a side slope far from the obvious lines. From there, He watched them lower a cylinder into a hole he had not known about, and then pump something white and slow into the ground. Flood, then. A man shouted numbers, and another man nodded as if math could arrange stone. Once, when the generator coughed, the ridge answered with a subtle roll, not an earthquake, not even a shiver, more like a throat clearing. The men paused and looked at one another with the exaggerated casualness of workers who have made a joke of fear. The woman with the reflective vest consulted her tablet and made a call. When they were done, the crane reversed and the night resumed, pretending not to be lit. He waited an hour before he walked into their absence. The air smelled like chemistry and denial. At the edge of the pit, his beam found the top of the new fill. Lime, yes, and a foam that set like pastry, but harder. He knelt and listened and heard nothing, and the nothing felt like the most articulate refusal he had ever received. He looked up and saw the town below him, a confetti of light. He stood and understood that all of those separate houses wanted to be alone, and also to belong to something, and that this is sometimes what resonance means when you are not doing science. Sympathy, sympathy, sympathy. On the drive back, he took the old road on purpose and slowed when he reached the pullout above the river. He turned off the engine and headlights, stepped out, and let the sky rehearse for August. The hum came then, not loud, just certain, riding up through his shoes. He closed his eyes and counted slowly to 3 and waited. The knocks arrived on their schedule, patient as anything made before measurement. He did not answer. He whispered instead, because there are ways to send acknowledgement without surrender. "I hear you," he said to the ground, to the man he could not carry out, to the file he would have to write in words that didn't yet exist. The ridge said nothing intelligible and everything that mattered. When he got home, the letter in the drawer was still where he had left it. He took it out, added a line. "If you find this, go to Laura first." And then the date. He found a second envelope and wrote another name on it, one he had not yet had the courage to involve, his daughter's. He sealed both with the stubborn gravity of a man whose life has been built from containing what he cannot fix. Then he slept because he had to. Before the sleep arrived, somewhere in the neighborhood, a dog barked 3 times and stopped. And though Ellison knew dogs are not metaphors, he smiled anyway and decided the world had just tried one on to see if it fit. In the morning, he would return to Station 12 through the lower access, alone or not alone, depending on whether language continued to refuse to do its job. In the morning, he would carry with him rope, light, recorder, patience, and the commitment to leave everything untouched that could be made worse by touch. In the morning, he would decide whether to knock, and he would decide not to, and he would keep deciding for as long as a decision could be maintained. For now, he turned on the recorder on his nightstand and let it listen to a house inventing silence around a man who had earned the sound beneath it. He woke before the alarm, the house already holding its breath the way it did on days when he knew what he intended and hoped the world did not. The letter in the drawer had acquired weight beyond paper. It made a soft thud when he closed the wood. He brewed coffee and set half of it in a travel mug and poured the rest down the sink, as if there were such a thing as being equal with a morning. Outside, the light was colorless, that hour when the road looks like a commitment. He drove without the radio and counted the miles by the way his hands adjusted on the wheel. Toward the ridge, the air sharpened. Pines crowded in as if to eavesdrop. At the trailhead, he found the note he'd left for himself on the dash get-in. Get proof. Get out ridiculous and perfect, the way simple plans feel before they meet ground. The lower access was where he had found it, a square of plywood put back so neatly it could have been part of the earth. He listened as he always did now. And as always, the first thing he heard was not the hum, but his own heart insisting it knew a rhythm. Then the tone surfaced, steady, familiar, 27 hertz, with that whisper of drift the lab had named, and he had felt in his bones before numbers were kind enough to agree. He slid off the cover, laid it to one side, and let the cold air rise around his wrists like a warning politely phrased. The ladder had begun to sweat in the night. He went down carefully, one boot and then the other, 1,000 small noises becoming one long sentence. Below, in the plywood room that pretended to be permanent, but had been built in a hurry, the air carried the smell of lime and diesel. The handwritten log still lay open on the instrument table. He snapped a photo of the last entry in case ink decided to become a rumor later. Cycle 15 containment, run subjective knocks persist. The initials were the same as last night. He took a slow breath, and then another, because taking a third too quickly felt like answering a question he hadn't been asked yet. The door beyond the plywood, the old metal door with the ghost of its numerals, sweated in a way that looked like fear and could only be condensation. He pressed his palm to it and felt no tremor. The hum lived through the steel and beside it, but not in it. That, more than anything, made him uneasier. He raised his hand to knock and left it there in the air between decisions. He lowered it again. He set the recorder on the table and announced the time and his name, because a man should leave himself a breadcrumb in his own voice. A footfall sounded in the plywood corridor behind him. It came like a polite cough. He turned with a finally useful calm and saw Ranger Hopkins in the doorway, hatless, hair wet with whatever water underground uses to keep secrets. The man raised both hands, not exactly in surrender, more in the posture of someone asking to borrow fire. "I figured you'd find this," Hopkins said, as if proud of him. "I figured you'd come alone." Ellison let the sentence be true and asked the question that did not accuse yet. "What is Cycle 15? Hopkins smiled without humor. "A mistake we keep repeating, because the first one made a nice chart." He glanced at the door. "They think if they feed it foam and lime in the right pattern, the tone will move and leave the ridge alone. They don't understand that what listens down there isn't angry. It's obedient." "You left me the note," Ellison said, and because it wasn't entirely a question, Hopkins nodded. "I wanted someone who isn't in their chain to see it, somebody who still writes sentences in a notebook." The hum shifted half a breath and settled again, like a sleeper turning. "Alan Morris," Ellison said, and the name changed the room. "He dropped into the lateral," Hopkins answered, "the one behind that door. There's a maintenance crawl he found, the first day he knocked because he thought he heard us. We weren't there yet." He looked down at his hands. He was alive for longer than he should have been. He reached into the pocket of his vest and placed something on the table. A ring, flattened on one side, scraped bright where metal had met metal again and again. "We took this off the threshold with a magnet after the first run. The knock kept time with the pump cycles. They called it interference." Ellison stared at the ring until it became an object again. He wanted to hate the man for not stopping whatever he had been paid to participate in. He also understood this. In systems with too many names on the header, individuals lose their pronouns. "Open it," he said finally, and Hopkins shook his head. "I don't carry the codes. They change them every day. It's keyed at the yard." He pointed to the plywood. "But the panel behind that sheet is old enough to respect a screwdriver." He handed Ellison a thin, flat bar, the kind intended for prying up trim, and took a second one for himself. Together, they lifted the edge and listened to the nails complain. Behind it, gray steel waited with its bolts and the old satisfaction of having done its job. They worked in silence that wasn't, The hum threaded itself through the scrape of metal and the small human sounds men make when they do scheduled disobedience. When the last bolt surrendered, Hopkins leaned his ear to the seam and shut his eyes, like a doctor listening through a wall to decide whether to stay in a profession. "You'll see the throat first," he said. "Then the turn. After that, it goes lower than we measured. I can't tell you not to go. It wouldn't work, and it wouldn't be the truth we owe the wife." He took a breath that shook. "If you hear 3, he began, and couldn't bring himself to finish the line that didn't need finishing. Ellison nodded. They set the panel aside. The door offered itself like a thought you're better for having refused before, and worse for refusing again. They didn't bring the heavy door fully open. They made a gap wide enough for a man to pass sideways if he convinced his shoulders to act like a promise. Cold breath slid through and settled on their faces. The air beyond had the damp, metallic mood of abandoned hospitals. Ellison took the small light and the rope and tied the rope to a bracket where it might hold a man who meant it. Hopkins stayed on his side of the hinge, with the bar angled like a lever against the door in case the mountain learned an opinion about closure. "If you're not back in 6, he said, and left the clause hanging because completing it out loud would make the 6 minutes perform differently. The crawl space barely permitted dignity. He moved in a side-foot shuffle that made his hip complain, in a voice from 3 years ago he had thought retired. The light found riveted curves, chalked numbers, a discarded mask that had hardened into the shape of a face. The hum deepened toward the turn, and with it another sound, intermittent, abrasive. A scrape. Pause. Scrape. As if something heavy were being edged along steel by hands that wished for better leverage. He made the turn, and the space opened, just enough to allow the idea of a room. On the right, a ladder went down into shadow. On the left, a short corridor ended in a blank plated wall where someone had written an arrow, and below it, the word lower in grease pencil that had not learned humility. He swept the beam down the ladder and found the floor a story below. He sat with his legs through the rung and let the light hang from his collar and began to descend. The lower vault felt like the idea of a vault, curved, resisting sound, trained by its own form to enforce quiet. The light caught the outlines of structural frames and the remains of instruments that had once required attention. A table lay on its side, its legs bent as if encouraged by a slow pressure. Against the far wall, something rested that at first looked like a bag of cement broken open, and then told the truth under light. A human shape partly coated in lime, the covering oddly smooth except where water had dripped and carved little riverbeds into the crust. He came at it sideways, along the wall, announcing his inches aloud, because narration concentrates courage. The face was a face only because eyes and mouth are patterns the brain cannot not find. Around what would have been the left wrist, a watch sat, the glass crazed, the strap hardened. He did not touch it with his hand. He used the flat bar like a dull scalpel to shift the crust near the wrist until a line of rubber showed. He pried gently, and the strap came away in his palm with the watch attached. It was a field model. The back was engraved. A. Morris. L.M. He closed his eyes for 1 second. Not to pray. To mark. When he opened them, the room had not forgiven anything and would not. He made himself look further, because men earn their titles with what they don't allow themselves to spare. Beside the shape lay a pack crushed flat. Inside the flattened cloth, enclosed in a zippered pocket, he found a small digital recorder. He thumbed it without meaning to. The red light flickered, feebly alive or pretending to be. He held it to his ear and pressed play. Static first, and then the tone, and then a voice that took the room by the throat because time cannot keep its promises to the living. Morris had the kind of voice men acquire when they spend their lives reporting facts to other people. "If you find this," the voice said, and Ellison swallowed air that felt raw, "you're either me or you're better at doors than I was." The tone swelled, then receded like a tide. I followed it to the lower vault. "Don't do that again. The knocks are real. That part was me. The other part, the hum answers, not with language, with pressure. It's in the wall. It's in me. I can't tell if it's outside or not." There was a long pause punctuated by the scrape he had been hearing, and then, "If Laura's listening, I'm sorry about the drill. I thought I'd be smart and make a new door. I was wrong." Another pause. "If the men upstairs are listening, don't pour more of whatever you're pouring. It pushes." The recorder clicked. 3 soft knocks came like punctuation. Then the file ended, not because the recording had nothing more to say, but because power and time are finite everywhere. He pocketed the watch and the recorder, and then, because it was his job, and also because leaving mattered, he took the second most difficult photograph of his career, a picture that proved a man's last shape without making spectacle of it. He reversed course then, hands on ladder, breath on cold rung, shoulder through the sideways passage, light arcing in a stupid, uncaring geometry. Hopkins received him like a man handing another man back to air. The ranger's eyes moved to the watch, then stopped moving for a beat, as if the idea behind them had caught. "We can get him out," Hopkins said, and Ellison shook his head, not because removal would be impossible, but because timing is part of reverence. "Not while they're running cycles," Ellison said. "Not until this stops pretending it's maintenance." They closed the old door, set the panel back, drove the nails quietly, and then stood with their backs against the plywood for a minute, not to rest, but because sometimes men need to lean on something that belongs to both of them. Above, through the ladder hole, a voice called a name that wasn't either of theirs. They looked at each other with the expression men get when options have narrowed to one narrow corridor, and that corridor is duty. Hopkins went up first. Slow, empty hands open. The woman with the vest stood at the edge of the makeshift room. 2 men behind her placed in a way that suggested they had learned about triangles. "Detective," she said, as if greeting him at a conference. "Ranger." Her smile did the same, strange almost. "Closed sight," she added. "You're both going to step out now." Ellison kept his hands visible and his voice even. "We found Morris." She tilted her head, which is a kindness and a weapon. "You found a body." He shook his head. "We found his watch. We found his recorder. He's in Lyme. Your cycles are making it worse." She glanced at one of the men, and he looked at the panel as if he could see through plywood. "Containment is stable," she said. "We'll recover remains when safe." The recorder in Ellison's pocket felt heavier than the ring in his other hand. "You have a file that says Cycle 15 was suspended," he said. "You have a note somewhere that says it shouldn't be run." She smiled again. "All cycles are under review." The phrase landed like dust. Outside, the sky had chosen a color that gave nothing away. They walked to the surface as if they were part of a tour and were observing safety decorum. In the trees at the ravine, a truck idled. Men waited to carry something to another place. Hopkins spoke for the first time with a sharpness that made the air behave. "I signed on to protect this land," he said, "not to teach it to repeat our mistakes." The woman looked at him with a softness that did not mean approval. "Your letter of resignation can go to your supervisor," she said. "Preferably, not today." She watched Ellison in the way good players watch an opponent arrange the table. "Detective, you'll turn over whatever you removed from the vault. That is federal property and evidence both." He nodded. "Make a receipt," he said, which made her smile reel for one beat, because bureaucracy is the one language both sides speak. At the station, he wrote the report that would become the record, and he wrote the other, the one that would become what people tell one another when the official thing makes them ill. He logged the watch and the recorder, printed the photograph of the lime-shelled shape on a page that folded its presence into grayscale. He typed with the steadiness of men who have learned that emotion ruins the crucial lines. He called the coroner, who asked a question the way doctors do when what they're asking is not whether, but when. He called Laura and told her he had her husband's watch and that he would bring it in person. He told her there was audio and that she had every right to hear it, and no obligation at all. She agreed to both truths, and then, in a soft voice, said, "Does the hum stop if I'm in the room?" He answered honestly, "It doesn't stop for anyone, but it does listen." By evening, the county received a formal notice from an office with a name that only existed when printed on letterhead. It said that hazardous environmental mitigation was underway and that the area would be secured until tests ensured public safety. The sheriff read it and pushed his chair back and went home early to walk a dog that had never once in its life done anything wrong. Ellison stayed. He cut a duplicate of the recorder file and placed it with the envelope in his kitchen drawer, because one copy held by the right person is sometimes the only name for safety that has ever worked. He went to Laura's the next morning with the watch in a small box he had no right to make look like a gift. She opened it and held the metal to her mouth like the world's smallest flask, as if warmth could persuade memory to behave. He set the recorder on the table and asked if she wanted him to press play. She nodded and took his hand, in a gesture so unpracticed that it told him more than her face ever would. They listened to wind and stone, and that carefully measured tone, and then to the man who had shared her kitchen. When the 3 soft knocks came, she closed her eyes and laid her free hand flat on the table, palm down, the way someone presses a sheet of paper to keep it from blowing away. When the file ended, she stood and stood still, and then sat. He would hate that he became part of their project, she said. He would hate that he didn't leave a better map. Ellison said, "He left the map you would have asked for if you had known what to ask." 2 days later, because a department has processes even when the ground doesn't, the coroner signed a preliminary identification based on recovered personal effects, and the state issued permission for a limited recovery under federal supervision. The woman with the vest called him, voice unchanged. "You can be present," she said. "You cannot interfere." He told her that if they treated the vault like a mine and not a test bench, he would have nothing to interfere with. She said she admired his commitment, and he said nothing, because there was nothing inside admiration that could help. They went in with masks and a stretcher that had seen other bad rooms. The foam set had hardened like brittle candy. The lime had drawn moisture and set some places and refused others. A man who knew how to move without making history made the cuts. They bagged what the world would accept as remains with the tenderness a team brings out of self-respect, not instruction. Ellison watched the door, and he watched the instruments, and he kept his eyes off the woman's hands, because watching them would have made him say names out loud. When they were done, and when the bag had been carried up like a word you must say without hating it, the hum changed again, as if the room had been waiting for a sentence to end. It rose a hair, that same fractional slide the lab had named drift, and then it settled lower. And then, though he would not write this, he thought it relieved. Hopkins did not return to his post. He dropped the key to his government truck at the office in an envelope that didn't bother with handwriting. Later, when Ellison asked around, people said they had seen him on the far side of the county, alone in a canoe, moving toward a line of willows that looked like they were learning choir. The federal crews stayed another week, filling and sealing, then filling again. Signs went up along the service road that said nothing about resonance and much about falling limbs. The audio drift stopped on a Tuesday, no different from any other, except that on that day, a coyote crossed the road in front of Ellison's car without looking at him, and he took it as a courtesy, which it wasn't. He brought the watch to Laura after the official release, and this time she wore it on a chain rather than a wrist. They stood in the doorway and promised to say the easier parts first if anything changed. He gave her the copy of the recording. She put it in the freezer because some people keep their best photographs there in case of fire. He didn't ask about it, because he understood, finally, that you let the living do magic wherever they choose to stash it. He drove to Salida to see Lemaine one more time. The old man sat on the porch as if he had been expecting a man-shaped apology and would accept any version. Ellison told him the cycle had ended, and the vault had given back what it could, and the old man nodded like someone who had waited too long for a word and heard it at the wrong volume. "It isn't angry," the engineer said again, this time to the mountain he could see from his chair. "It's obedient." He picked at the arm of the chair as if there were music underneath the paint. "We made a shape. The ridge learned it. Maybe it will forget. Humans do." Ellison thanked him for the notebooks, and Lemaine said, "We only ever build two kinds of rooms, ones that hold us and ones that teach us how we sound." Mara published the story that could be published. It did not say Quiet Earth, because she did not feel like losing a year to redactions that would black out the nouns. It did not say Station 12 because naming invites tourists, and tourists have terrible ears. It did say a man named Alan Morris had been found below an old federal installation, and that the county had recovered what love can recognize from lime. It did say that a tone had been measured, and that math had been performed, and that nobody owed the mountain a silence it hadn't earned. The comments under the article divided themselves, as they always do. A third called it a cover-up. A third called it weather. A third told stories about uncles who heard things in mines. Somewhere, a boy in shop class built a small subwoofer and tested a plank at 27 hertz and filmed it for his channel and accumulated the kind of attention that feels like learning, but is not. Ellison kept the original of the recorder file in the envelope in his drawer for 1 month, and then, because memory is kinder when shared, he gave it to the county archive with an instruction: hold sealed for 10 years, then release to the public. He left a copy for himself on a drive that had no other files, so he wouldn't trick his hands into deleting it. On the anniversary of the day the Ridge answered him with a single knock, he sat in his kitchen with the lights off and played the file at a volume that made the cabinets resonate just enough to suggest they might be listening. He turned it off when the knocks arrived, because there is a difference between honoring and rehearsing. When the first snows came, the Ridge accomplished what it always accomplishes, made the valley less certain. He drove up once, not to look for anything, simply to stand in the clearing and let the cold find his fingers. The plate was buried now under a skin of ice, where spruce needles had scribbled scripture. He placed his palm to the ground, because a man should check his superstition against the weather once a season. He felt nothing but cold. He smiled because he had earned that version of nothing. On the way back down, he counted hairpin turns and decided not to count them next time. At the diner, Warren poured from a pot heavy enough to make a point. "You get it fixed?" she asked, not unkindly. He said, "We got it told." She nodded, like that was how most things ended when they ended well enough. The sheriff gave him the kind of conversation bosses rehearse. "Take a week," he said. "Take 2. Ellison took 3 days and a half and built a shelf he had meant to build for a year, the kind that requires a room to admit where it has sagged. He called his daughter and told her he'd be late to the thing he had promised, then arrived on time because there are rules you make when you finally learn what counts. He put the copy of the watch engraving on his refrigerator under a magnet, not as a trophy, not as a punishment, but as a way of keeping verbs in the house. He slept well one night and badly the next 3, and then well again, which is how truce works. On a mild Sunday, he stood at the fence. He had helped repair and talked with Laura about a stray dog that had adopted her street. It wore a collar without a name and learned the route to the diner faster than the men who had lived here all their lives. "I'm going to call him 3, she said, and laughed a laugh that sounded like a woman retrieving something small from a river she had thought too fast. He nodded and did not mention that he would have chosen a different number. Not everything needs to thread itself through a pattern to be true. By spring, the lab sent a last email unasked for, a graph attached, the line flat, the drift gone, the note that said in a plain way he trusted, background tone below noise, no further anomalous structure. He read it twice because people deserve the ritual of confirmation even when they've already believed what their bodies told them. He replied with a "thank you" and did not press send, then did, because gratitude is a discipline. He went to the ridge one more time alone, not secret, simply solitary. The trees had remembered their green. The plate lay under a thin thatch of last year's needles. He stood a while and thought about men who measure things they shouldn't, and about other men who insist on going anyway, and about the fact that if you remove names from either group, you end up with one animal trying to hear itself. He did not kneel. He did not touch. He said the man's name once, not loudly, not like a rite, and let the sound spend itself. Then he walked back to the car and drove down the mountain, and did not look in the mirror. If anyone asked, he said the case was solved, and if they pressed, he said that solved meant proved enough for a coroner and true enough for a wife. And if they asked after the knocks, he said a thing he had learned to say without argument. The mountain repeats what we teach it, some lessons ending in bursts, some ending in quiet. In the station, his younger colleagues began calling the Ridge thing the Morris case, again, which was correct, and he watched them age a little around their eyes when they realized why the renaming mattered. On his desk, folded under a stack of forms that had nothing to do with resonance, lay the federal receipt for the recorder and the watch. He had made copies, handed them where copies go, and let the originals belong to the long story the county keeps in a vault that does not hum. On the day the county placed Alan Morris's name in the column where the word closure appears without a question mark, Ellison stood under a sky that had been cleaned of weather for the occasion and listened for anything the ground might try to say out of habit. It said what ground usually says when it has been asked too many questions. Nothing you can write down without embarrassing both of you. Laura stood to his left and did the small things the living do for the living. The hand on the shoulder of a friend, the nod at a sentence that wasn't eloquent enough but had been brave to get here. After, people hugged the way towns hug, and then they put chairs back where chairs had learned to live, and then the afternoon accepted that it had work to do and broke itself into errands. He drove to the station, wrote one more line in a notebook that had carried a good weight, and closed it with the satisfaction of hinges doing what they were meant to. That night, late, a storm walked the ridge just close enough to be conversational. Rain tapped the windows in small sets of 3 because clouds also love pattern. He smiled, allowed it, turned on the recorder at his nightstand out of habit, then turned it off on purpose. He lay in the dark and let the house hold him without explanation. Somewhere far off, a freight rolled, and the floor learned its rhythm and forgot it. He breathed. He waited. Nothing answered but sleep.